Welcome everyone to a special Blistered Thumbs roundtable taking a look at the beta of Neverwinter from Cryptic Studios and Perfect World Entertainment. My name is Shaun and I'm here as the voice of the people. I'm the guy who, I've got some experience with MMO, I'm semi-familiar with D&D, but I'm not an expert on either. The people who are the experts are my fellow roundtable members. To represent particularly the MMO side of things, we've got Oda Nobunaga, aka Lorne.
Wow, holy butchering my name, Batman.
Mr. Nobunaga has been offended gravely.
And representing the obsessive-compulsive insane, the D&D side.
You can just call me Skitch. That's usually why I go by Skitch instead of Skitchiano, because I preemptively choose a name that people can't butcher unless they don't know how K's and CH's work.
So that's who we are, and Neverwinter is a new, upcoming, free-to-play MMO that's been in development since around, let's say 2010, and it is, as the title should give away, set in the world of Dungeons & Dragons, specifically Forgotten Realms. There is another famous or infamous, depending on who you talk to, Dungeons & Dragons MMO, literally Dungeons & Dragons Online, which is set in a different setting called Ereborn, but this is a second Dungeons & Dragons MMO, completely unrelated in all facets to the other one, and I think by that very nature, people are going to be curious, and then you throw in the fact that a lot of people, including myself, have very fond memories of Neverwinter Nights. By the time you're listening to this, the first beta weekend will have come to a close. The next one will be in the first week of March, and then there's a third one planned in the third week of March. No word yet how far beyond that the beta process will go. I'll tell you this much, I do not think the game's going to be launching in April, okay? I think, at the very least, we won't see it until fall, but that is just my theory. I do not have anything definitive on that front. So yeah, we've been playing the press beta, we got to try out a lot of aspects of the game, we got to level up, we've played through the characters, we've tried out some features, including the Foundry that we'll touch upon soon enough. So let's lay it out. Oda, what are your initial impressions of the game?
I will tell people this. I was enjoying the game, and then I hit level 17 and started on a quest series that deals with the spell plague, and it kind of starts the real kind of meat and potatoes of the game. And then I actually started to really enjoy the game. The game starts slow, and it starts off, and you think, oh, this is just like every other free-to-play MMO. Oh, man. Well, I hope the game doesn't... Oh, my God! Oh, did you see that? I gotta find out what the next quest does. And then you're hooked. And then suddenly you're level cap. That's my initial impression.
Oh, geez, the level cap.
How about you, Skitch? What were your initial impressions?
My initial impressions, and you'll kind of hear me kind of reiterate back to this, is that it is a easy to approach, fun to play action MMO that does emphasize tactics in your play, but is more related to the 4th edition license in the lore and the setting and the narrative than it is in the mechanical implementation of 4th edition rules. Their goal, first and foremost, was not to make an accurate representation of 4th edition rules. Their first goal was to make a fun-to-play action MMO that takes place in Neverwinter and brings the world of Neverwinter and Faerun to life without as much emphasis on making it strictly 4th edition D&D Online or something like that.
For my money, for my initial impression, I would say on that regards, they succeeded. For comparison's sake, for those of you who need some sort of grounding, gameplay-wise, it somewhat reminds me of Terra. It's definitely not a WoW clone, okay? It does not play really anything like WoW. I know Cryptic. I've enjoyed their previous games. I was expecting a polished, well-done game. And at first, I thought it was okay, but I wasn't necessarily sure it would hook me in. But yeah, the game definitely gets more impressive the more you put into it.
And I think what is going to be key for this game is their implementation of their payment model. Mm-hmm. This is free to play, and so far, this is a beta, and we're press, so obviously they're not going to be hurling all the pay stuff at us, right? But so far, the only thing I've seen that you need to pay for, and you don't even really need to pay for, is these astral diamonds. And, you can accumulate these astral diamonds on, like, a chance gambling roll once an hour in-game by doing an action at a specific place. But if that's the only way they're monetizing this game, I don't think they'll make a ton of money.
It's interesting because they've been asked about the monetization stuff, and I don't think they've kind of solidified what parts of the game they want to monetize. And I think part of it is going to come down to possibly not necessarily restricting some of the content. I mean, they will be restricting some of the content for monetization purposes. For example, current way to access the thing we'll talk about later, the Foundry. The only way you can access it now is to pay the $200 Hero of the North sort of pre-purchase pack. And I suspect that later on, that will be a purchase in-game with either some sort of Astral Diamonds or other sort of resource.
Let me be very clear. We don't know all the details, but I know for a fact it's not going to cost $200 to access the Foundry.
No.
The Foundry, for those of you who don't know, is the user-generated content part of Neverwinter. Cryptic have experimented with this before, using the exact same name, actually, in Star Trek Online. And it's exactly what it sounds like. It lets people create their own missions and then distribute these missions for other players to play. We will talk about how successful it is or not. If it works, you could definitely see how that could be very valuable, because it could essentially give the game unlimited end-game content, which is always a problem with MMOs. All you need are a handful of people who get into it, and generally, if the tool set is decent, there are always a handful of people to get into these things, and boom, you've got instant content. It's more going to be like you could pay money for early access to the tools, or you can level up and earn the money that way, and by maybe the time you get level 30, you can get it. But the missions created by them will be free for everyone.
Sure, and that's a good correction to make, because again, I'm referring to the creation tools, not access to the user-created content itself.
Let me cut to the point. This is not Cryptic or Perfect World's first rodeo ride, to say the very least. Perfect World knows how to monetize a game, and Cryptic has converted 2 of their previous games to free-to-play models. And if we can use Champions and Star Trek as any basis to judge by, what they most likely they will do is all the general content will be accessible. There will be cosmetic kind of stuff that really the fan who would want to pay for stuff will want to pay for it. There will probably be experience boosters. There'll be the usual assortment. And if they can find an audience, I don't think they'll have any trouble monetizing it in a way that doesn't come too badly. But they're not going to put missions, I think, in general, behind a pay gate. And I also don't think you'll be able to pay to win.
Yeah, I think that's kind of a fair assessment for the time being. But, I mean, we have to keep in mind, and I think this will be a good transition point. A part of what we've seen in the beta is a relatively constrained amount of some of the content, which in and of itself, the content they've announced in terms of especially character classes has been somewhat constrained. And I think that might be hiding some of the plans they might be having down the road regarding either class options or otherwise, where it's not necessarily pay to win, but it is something like they have this thing called glory in the game, which I don't know whether that refers to the deity things you call for or otherwise, but I know that on DDO, there are races and classes that you unlock either by paying or by earning enough sort of renown on a server to unlock that race or class on that server. So there could be something like that. But again, this is all speculation.
Yeah, this is all speculation. Let's talk about what we do know. Let's talk about what we did play. So there were 3 classes available in this beta. There was the Cleric, the Fighter, and the Rogue. And basically your healer, your damage dealer, and your tank, more or less. And we'll get into that. I started out as the Cleric, Oda started out as the Fighter, Skitch started out as the Rogue. So let's talk a little bit about these classes and how they played and what they showed us about the game. So why don't you start us out, Oda?
Right. From the perspective of, I guess, the tank, your whole premise is around getting aggro, or threat, as they use the universal MMO term, making monsters hate you, and then soaking up all that damage. Now, initially, in the first few levels, you're just like, oh, okay, I'm swinging my sword and stuff's hitting me. Okay, I don't do much damage, but I don't take much damage. Fair enough. But then as you get up in the levels, you have a shield, obviously, and so you have to raise it by holding the shift button. And the shift button is sort of like a defaulto action button, which Skitch and Shaun will talk about in a minute, of their perspective classes. But the fighters raises his shield and blocks all incoming damage. And by all, I mean all incoming damage. Traps, magic, death blows, everything. Only damage over time spells is the only thing it doesn't block, and that's only if you have already been hit by it. But you have a meter, a guard meter, and this lowers every time you take a shot. And if you take a really big shot, it lowers a lot. If you take a kill shot, it breaks your guard, but you don't take the damage. And your whole thing is generating guard power and blocking things while doing enough damage to make things hate you, and kind of cycling your abilities to like keep the damage to a minimum, and healing yourself and doing damage and protecting your allies. So the whole premise is to survive while making everything hate you. And once you get the hang of it, once you realize that, obviously there's that half a split second of lag, it's not a console game, you have to realize you need a half second input. But once you figured it out, you can't be killed by anything. You can do the stupidest things ever Now, the problem is it might take you 20 minutes to kill what you've just done, but you'll eventually do it so long as you're smart. However, if you just log into things, you're going to die. You're going to die. You can't just fumble with the warrior, and if you don't block, like if you don't raise your shield, you're just not playing the class. And you also have to learn that when you have your shield up, you actually have different action bars. And initially it doesn't look like it because the icons, they don't look like they change. But then you notice in your list of powers that they have the same icons. And I think that's a bit of a... I think Cryptic needs to take a look at that because, yeah, the icons are exactly the same, and it's just like, and then I realized, how am I stabbing over my shield while I'm guarding? How am I doing that? But yeah, you can attack from behind your shield, so not only are you basically invulnerable, you can keep attacking, and that was kind of an eye-opener for me as well, the fact that I could do abilities with my shield up. At that, pretty much, I was unkillable, and I haven't died in the game since. But yeah, all in all, for my class, I enjoyed it. I'm definitely a melee guy. I love being in melee. I love hitting things with swords. So I'll either play this class or the Great Weapon Fighter, but they don't have that released yet. So for now, my money, Guardian Fighter.
It's funny because inadvertently we each ended up, our first class was like a perfect fit for us. I know that's how it ended up with me in the Cleric. So you use the left and right mouse buttons to do your basic attacks. It's basically a distance attack, shooting out beams of light. And the Cleric has one that does damage and has a second one that does less damage, but basically places a marker. As long as an enemy has that marker on them, anyone who damages them gets back health for damaging. And that's the whole basis of the Cleric class in general, because especially early on, all of the Cleric's unique abilities, like for instance, the first real special ability you get is basically a crowd control ability, which damages a group of enemies and heals you and everybody who's around you for a little bit of that damage. And a lot of your attacks revolve around hurting enemies to help yourself. And eventually the class gets a unique ability, which, first of all, my shift button basically is about dodging. It lets me dodge to one side or the other just automatically, and I've got a stamina bar. And at least for the Cleric, the stamina bar is very short, so I can maybe dodge 2 or 3 times before I can't dodge for a while. But what I'm building up is healing. And once I reach a certain level, then I can activate with the Alt key. It lets me switch my basic attacks. One drains the health from enemies, the other gives health to friends. Basically, I become like the medic from Team Fortress 2. And also, my special abilities get slightly different variations as well. So that is basically the Cleric, and I really enjoyed the class, because even if I heal somebody else, I heal myself as well. All of my spells always heal me. And it makes the class very easy to solo, and I think that's true for all 3 of these classes, and I think that's by design. I think the game is very much intended to be played, if you want, by yourself without friends. It's definitely possible.
To kind of point out something to people who have played Dungeons & Dragons 3rd and 4th edition, the current Cleric class they have is called a Devoted Cleric, and people who've played 3rd edition D&D will look at the Cleric class and think, what the heck is this? This is not a Cleric. Why is he not wearing plate armor and swinging a mace in the front line? And that's because it's modeled off of the 4th edition, what's called the Laser Cleric. That one models it to a T. The character I played as was the Trickster Rogue, and closely related to the Artful Dodger variant of the Rogue in 4th edition. And the Trickster Rogue is the DPS character, and basically there's a number of mechanics that come into play for him that he really exploits. Number one is just using attacks that do high amounts of damage on their own with his at-will attacks like Slide Flourish, it being the big one that you do most of the time in melee. And otherwise, one thing that all the classes have are kind of 2 things. They have, one is a secondary thing that their powers build off of, like the fighter having the guard meter and the rogue eventually getting the stealth meter to use to drop into stealth. The other thing is their quote-unquote daily powers, which they do by building up action points from doing whatever their class does best and then just unleashing some massive power every once in a while. So for the rogue, I do damage, and then all of a sudden I get to do AoE stuff. So the thing about the rogue is that you would think that the rogue is probably the weakest of the characters in terms of survivability, and he would be if you got yourself in line and you didn't avoid attacks. But rogues have high mobility. When you get into stealth, you can completely drop aggro. You have an ability that puts down a decoy of yourself for enemies to be drawn away from you. And if you cycle those accordingly and have some healing potions, you can survive fights yourself while dishing thousands of points of damage relatively quickly.
You have to understand, folks, the first time I really saw what the rogue could do was we are fighting the boss of that first big storyline. It's what Oda was talking about earlier. He's got this massive life bar that stretches across the screen, and Skitch does his thing, The life bar gets reduced by 75% with one attack.
Well, again, it was one attack that had several things stacked up against it because I did something to increase my damage output by going to stealth. Oda increased damage to the enemy by doing something himself. I was flanking the guy at the same time, and so all those things kind of stacked. One of those things about the game is that it is an action MMO, but it really encourages not just blind hack and slashing. You really want to pay attention to your team tactics, your organization, and otherwise. A great example of this, and we can probably talk about this later on, is the fact that you can't move while attacking at the same time unless your attack has mobility baked into it. But, I mean, those are just parts of what happened. So with the Trickster Rogue, what I found when I got higher in levels was just, again, this amazing ability to really control the attention enemies had towards me and be able to really isolate targets and take them down while occasionally dropping some area damage or otherwise, and sometimes cycling in and out of stealth ridiculously fast by knowing how to mitigate attention towards me. So it was a lot of fun to play.
It's funny, because if you were watching the live stream that Skitch was doing at one point of this, it might have looked like this was the easiest game in the world. And even I started to wonder, because I was tagging along, I was much lower leveled than the other two. And they were basically pulling me along to try and get me up to their level. And the game totally lets you do that. You just have to share the quest and all that, which is something I always appreciate, because nothing's worse than MMO when you get a friend in and they've got to spend like a week, 2 weeks getting up to your level before you can actually start playing. But anyways, on the topic, it looked so easy. But later on, after we were done, when I went back online, I talked to other people, and I also started messing around with the other classes myself. And it only looks easy if you know what you're doing. Because I was talking to people who were dying left and right, and who couldn't make any progress, and who were struggling because they were trying to just play this like any other game. And they weren't paying attention to what their class could actually do, and they weren't reading what the text was, and they weren't. This is a skill game, but it's not a skill game in the way that you've got to have,
like you would a Devil May Cry / Bayonetta / those sort of stylish action games where you need really accurate frame-specific action timing. But the biggest things that I noticed in this game is that are really important are positioning, timing, knowing what types of powers to have in your sort of queue, and I'll explain a little bit more about how the actual powers are organized, and that's how you survive. You have to understand what your class can do and how your class ultimately survives in the context of a fight.